Who would be the ideal person to wake the divine dragon? If I can't think of the person, I'll have to envision one. A gallant knight. Strong, courteous, and kind.
Are you winning, son?
Oh, Divine One. Good morning. I was just,
Not now, Dad! Fire Emblem Engage is the newest entry to the Fire Emblem series, and in this one you'll be playing as the Divine Dragon, and in typical Fire Emblem fashion, your enemy is the Fell Dragon that is being reawoken, and you need to stop it. To stop the Fell Dragon, you're tasked with collecting all of the Emblem Rings, and the Emblem Rings are these rings that have basically the souls of former Fire Emblem protagonists in them, and your character is able to summon them with his power of being a Divine Dragon. So with this, you can summon the former protagonists such as Ike, Roy, Marth, and basically they'll help you fight, and they have some power that you need to help stop the Fell Dragon. The story starts off as simple as that, so that's pretty much all the context you'll need. And I wouldn't say it's a bad story, but it's definitely not as engaging as other Fire Emblem games.
Boo! You stink!
Some of my biggest issues with the story in this game is that during the early and mid game there were some key story moments that were sad or they wanted you to feel something. And I found it very hard to take the game serious with how goofy the characters looked, and also it was the early and mid game and I didn't really know the characters that well either, so I couldn't feel for them, plus I wasn't used to the new anime style. During key story moments it just felt very hard to take it serious or feel for the characters in serious moments. So I felt like that took away from the story a little bit, especially in the early and mid game. There's a certain point right about in the middle of the game where you get over like basically, I don't want to say the climax because I feel like it didn't like peak there, but you get over like the midpoint of the game and it gets a lot more interesting. I feel like the game's story, like it's like a steady like linear increase from the beginning of the game. Like it starts out pretty low, but the more you play, the more you start caring about it, and the more, at least for me, the more I grew.
I think I've grown up a little.
Accustomed to the art style, and I could take these characters seriously because I was learning more about them. So by the end game, there was a lot of cool twists and surprises that actually kept me intrigued in the story. And also, I did start to feel for the characters. Like the end game cutscenes had me tearing up a little bit. So I did grow accustomed to it, and I do think the story definitely got way better closer to the end. I think with this game, they were trying to pull story points or story like bits from other Fire Emblem games, which makes sense because the other characters are in this one. So maybe, you know, it's just a neat little callback. But if you're like a longtime fan and you've played a lot of the games, you'll notice it feels like there's tropes from every Fire Emblem game in this one in terms of the story. And I don't hate the story. I think it's quite good. It even gets quite good towards the end. So I'm not like hating on it, but it does feel like someone tried to write a really tropey Fire Emblem based off of all the previous games. So overall, the story does, I think it does redeem itself in the later half of the game. Like I said, it's boring in the beginning, but the more you play, the more intrigued you get. So I think it is overall a good story, but it is like basic and bare bones sort of. Like it's there to serve its purpose, and I think it did a good job, but it's not extraordinary, and I don't think it rivals a lot of the other older titles, or previous titles, in terms of story. Now let's talk about the gameplay of Fire Emblem Engage. Now, this might be a hot take, but I personally think that Engage has the most fun battle gameplay of the whole series. And just as a disclaimer, I'll give you my reasons, but just as a disclaimer, I do want to say I played on hard and classic. So there's normal, hard, and maddening for difficulty, and then there's casual or classic, whether you want permadeath or not. And I did hard and classic, just for reference. Now, let's get to talking about it. The basics of combat are pretty much what you would expect from Fire Emblem. It's still grid-based, it still has player phase where you move all your units, and enemy phase where they move all their units. So I'm not going to go over the basics of combat, but let's talk about what makes Engage so fun and unique. When it comes to Fire Emblem, something I really enjoy is, especially in the newer games where they kind of encourage it a little bit more, like Three Houses and Awakening, where you can change your classes a lot and get skills from a bunch of different classes, and kind of make your units unique to you. Like, there's so many options, so it's kind of rare that if you're going a little crazy and making unique units, like, you know, turning Dorothea into a brawler instead of, you know, a mage or something like that in Three Houses. I really enjoy that in the games, and going around to go a bunch of different classes to make a unique build and turn your units into monsters. That level of customizability has always made Fire Emblem really fun to me. In the newer games, like Three Houses, I've done some crazy builds, like turning Ignatz into a warrior, like an axe user, instead of an archer, which normally he would be. And that ended up being insanely fun for me. And it led to like a very unique experience. You know, I'm telling my friends about it, and they're like, "What? Like, I would have never thought of doing that. I made him an archer or whatever." So it's stuff like that that really makes Fire Emblem the experience more unique to me. And also, I love the permadeath of Fire Emblem, like having, you know, because it makes the experience unique to you. So stuff like that just really emphasizes the experience for me, because talking to other people, even though we played the same game and having a vastly different experience, is something I've always really enjoyed in video games. So sorry about the rant, but the customizability is a big part for me, and that's part of the reason I enjoy Engage so much, is because they do change it a bit, because now, instead of getting abilities and skills that carry over from classes, now it's based off of the new Emblem system. As I said earlier, the Emblem rings are the rings with the souls of the previous Fire Emblem characters in them. So the way they work in terms of gameplay is when you equip them to a unit, the unit will get a boost in stats, and they'll also get some skills based off of the character that is in the ring. So on baseline, you just get a stat bonus and you get some extra skills, but during combat you can also engage, which is a 3-turn power-up that basically gives you access to that unit's weapons. You get like a super move ability, and sometimes like a little bit extra abilities as well. So the rings alone allow for a good bit of customizability, because you can give these rings to different characters without having to, you know, like reclass a character and waste resources on a character trying out something new and fresh, and having it be a bad idea or something. Now you can just kind of switch around the rings. So if you want an Armored Knight with really good movement, you can give him the Sigurd ring. Or you just want a Pegasus Knight that can attack a lot, so give him the Martha ring or something like that. So you can try out like a bunch of cool strategies with this. Or, you know, perhaps you have a unit that is like, it's a strength unit, but they're really good at magic for some reason. They're just getting a lot of magic level ups. You could just try giving them, you know, maybe Celica's ring, so they can go around and cast magic as well with using Celica's weapons. So there's cool stuff like that where even at the base level, without even like having to, you know, invest a lot in a character, so before you waste all the resources and stuff, you can get a little silly and mix up stuff with just by giving characters different emblem rings and messing around with that. The emblems I also find really neat because they are the characters from older games, and a lot of their skills and abilities are really neat references to other games. I'm going to use Byleth as an example because it's the most recent game other than Engage, so I hope a lot of people will know it. But the Byleth has a skill in this game called Divine Pulse, which is based off of their 3 houses mechanic where you could go back in time to redo your turn. But in this game, it's as a skill, and basically, based on your character's luck, you have a chance to re-roll an attack that would have missed. So it's a kind of like a neat little play on, you know, being able to rewind time in 3 houses. So there's neat little things like that, which I thought were, like, it was nice to see as a Fire Emblem fan, which obviously, even if this is your first game, it's still just, you know, a fun little ability to have. But if you're also a longtime fan, you'll get some of the references, and it'll be a little bit cooler just to see the older characters in a newer game. Then there's the super moves, which you can only do while engaged with the emblem, and only once per time you're engaged. And these are also neat little references. Like, for example, Lucina's is, I think it's called All for One, and it's based off of, in Awakening, how you could have pair-up attacks, where if people were near the enemy you're attacking, they will also attack before you attack. And Lucina's is like a big emphasis on that, where basically all the units in tiles close to you will all attack the enemy before you do. So, like I said, if you're a fan, there's all these neat little references that you'll notice to the older games and their mechanics. But also, if you're a new fan, I mean, this is just a cool super move to use. So I think the game's still fun and can be enjoyed by newer players, or if this is your first entry to the series. But also, if you're an older fan, you'll just get all the references and why these super moves and skills are the way they are. Now that you understand what the emblems are, let's go talk about the customizability I was talking about earlier. So in this game, you don't keep class skills when you reclass, they're like stuck with the class. So the main way you're going to be earning skills in this game is through inheriting them from the emblem rings. As you use an emblem ring on a unit, that unit will deepen their bond with the emblem, and that will allow more and more skills to be unlocked while you're using the ring. But if you want to keep some of these skills while you're not using the ring, you can actually inherit them from the emblem themselves, and that's how you're going to be unlocking most of your skills to your units in this game. So you're going to want to switch around emblem rings to get different abilities and stuff, so you can keep them on your units forever, and then also have a different emblem ring so your character can be very diverse in their build. Aside from the emblem rings you can engage with, there's also like these rings that you can create using like, it's basically a gacha system where you can roll for random rings, and it's basically everyone but the main characters of their games. So, you know, like if you roll from the world of, you know, the Hero King, which is Marth, you'll get a bunch of Fire Emblem 1 characters, and all of them just give stat buffs, you know, like let's say +2 defense, +1 resistance, or something like that, depending on who the character is. And then if you get some really good ones, some of them might give you a unique ability with it as well. But you can't use these along with emblem rings, so they're kind of like something to have while you don't have all the emblem rings as you're playing through the game, because you're not going to have all of them from the start. So it's just a neat little mechanic to include other characters and also give your characters who don't have emblem rings a nice little buff. Another new thing they added in this game is class types. So depending on the class you are, you'll have a type assigned to it. So simple ones are for horseback units, they'll have the cavalry type. And for any units on Pegasus or Wyvern, they'll have the flyer type, which is just to distinguish their difference in movement compared to normal units. But there's also more interesting ones like healers now. Most of them are key adepts, which means that they have an ability called chain block. So while they're at full health, they can basically prevent an ally from taking damage and instead taking a % of health from themselves. So that's a neat little thing for healers because, you know, when you start a battle, all your characters are going to be full health. So, you know, you can't heal them like turn 1, but if you want to put an ally in a little bit of danger, but then chain block them, it's a neat little new way to use healers. And then there's also backup units who, basically, if they're adjacent to a enemy while another ally attacks, they'll attack first, and then your character you were originally attacking with will attack after. So there's neat little things like that to freshen up the combat, and new strategies to implement into your gameplay. So those are pretty cool, and there's also more types. I just wanted to give a few examples. Another thing the class types affect are the emblem rings. Certain emblem abilities or emblem skills will have different effects or maybe even a little bonus depending on the class type that they're being used by. That's another thing to keep in mind when you're changing classes or assigning emblem rings to different characters. On top of all that, Engage also brought back some mechanics from older Fire Emblem games, such as weight and build. Weight is on weapons and build is a stat on your unit, and basically they play hand in hand to each other, where if your weight is too heavy for your character's build, then your speed will suffer when you use that weapon. So it's another thing to keep in mind when choosing what weapons to use, and with them they also brought stuff back such as slim weapons, which are an older weapon type, which the main appeal to them was that they weren't very heavy. Aside from the slim type weapons, there's also other types of new weapons, such as heavy weapons, which are for swords, they're considered blades. For axes, they're great axes. Lances, they're great lances. So these new heavy weapon types, if you use them, you'll attack second and you can't follow up. But when you hit the enemy, one, they do a lot of damage, but two, they will knock back the enemy, and if they get hit into a wall, you'll break the enemy, which is also a new mechanic. Breaking an enemy allows the next unit to attack that enemy while they're broken to not be counterattacked. So even if you attack a sword user with a sword user, if they were broken by the previous attack, that means that they cannot counterattack. Some other returning weapons are knives are back from Fates. So instead of giving debuffs to the enemy, now all knives are 1 to 2 range and they poison enemies. But poison works where for each stack of poison on an enemy unit, they take 1 more point of damage from all sources. So it's not really something where you just put poison and then like run away from them. They'll die eventually. It is a different type of poison where you'll have to basically stack it up to do even bigger damage to a unit. And yet another thing returning is now magic is more differentiated between wind, fire, and lightning. Wind is effective against flyers like it usually has been in the older games. Fire is kind of like the basic one. And then lightning has extra range over the others. So that's back where magic, like the different schools of magic, act a little bit differently. And now that we know a lot about the weapons in the game, now let's talk about the weapon triangle. In this game, the weapon triangle is the standard where sword beats axe, axe beats lance, and lance beats sword. But now, instead of giving you different bonuses, now if you are fighting in a weapon triangle advantage, you will break the enemy, which means they can't counterattack you if you have hit them first, as well as the next unit to attack them, they also can't counterattack. So it makes the weapon triangle a little bit more important, especially against tougher enemies. You might want to break them so you can have all your units kind of gang up on them while they're defenseless. And aside from the main weapon triangle, there's also fist weapons are back, I forgot to mention. Now they're like scrolls rather than like gauntlets, but now you have like, martial arts scrolls, which is really cool because a lot of healers have access to them, so I thought it was kind of dope. I really like the fist weapons in Three Houses, so I'm happy to see them back. But yeah, so now there's fist weapons, and most of them are tied to healers, but basically fist now just beats bows, knives, and magic all, and there's no like triangle to it. Fists just beat up all the nerds, I suppose. With all these new tools and mechanics at our disposal, you might be wondering about the difficulty of the game. I played on hard classic, and I didn't lose any units, which is rare for me on my first playthrough of a new Fire Emblem game. So I kind of want to say it's too easy, but also it's not like I was steamrolling missions by any means. There was a lot of hard missions and like ones that I really struggled through, but it never really felt like my unit, like a unit specifically, was like super in danger of dying, So maybe it's just because of the new mechanics that like I felt like all my units could kind of come back even if they were in a bad spot, or maybe I'm just a better player now because I've played a lot of the games. But I played on hard classic, and it felt a little easy because I'm used to being in a point of like struggling where I either lose a unit or like more times where I'm really close to losing units. So I don't know. It's hard to say if it's too easy because, like I said, I'm a longtime fan. Maybe I should have played on Maddening for my first time to get like an experience that was struggling for me. But I was a little scared of that. Now let's talk about the maps in the game. So for the main story, the maps are very varied, actually. I think they did a really good job with keeping things interesting with different terrains and different maps where you're indoor, you're outdoor, you're in, this continent. All the maps felt very different, and they were very unique and varied in their own way, which I thought was a big plus to the game. And on top of that, there were also paralogs, which were for the emblem rings to deepen their bond. For example, Lucina's takes place in Arena Ferox, completely based off of the Awakening map, and Lynn's paralog takes place on the Sakaean Plains map, which I think is in Lynn's route only of Fire Emblem 7, which I did in Fire Emblem 7. And that was very cool to see, and also all the paralog maps have remixed music from the original games, which is awesome. And speaking of which, I thought the paralogs were really well done because, they are sort of just copy and paste of the old game maps, but they have remixed music. It's really cool to see them again in like a 3D environment. For example, like Fire Emblem 4's map was excellent because for those who have played Fire Emblem 4, the maps are huge and usually like packed to the brim with units. And they did a really good job of kind of like representing that in Engage without making it completely unfair or like unfun. So I thought that was really, really cool. There's some really neat paralogs, but the main story also has its own merits, but it plays more like traditional. They're not going to just bring in stuff from other games for the main story. And the main story did a very good job. They have varied objectives for the missions, not like super crazy, but there are certain missions that have different objectives than just, kill this guy or kill all the enemies. So that was really nice to see. The things I disliked most about the maps in this game is a lot of the maps relied on reinforcements. So I think with this game they had a trouble balancing it a little bit because of how overpowered you are, I guess. They give you a lot of tools at your disposal. And I think basically to combat that, they give you this false sense of security that you're like, oh, there's only this many enemies, like, sure, I got this all planned out. And then units just come from like, basically where you started the map. So now you're like in a pincer attack, which makes the game really rough. But I think I don't know, personally, I don't really like it that much. It made sense in other games where they're respawning from forts or stairs and stuff like that. But in this game, they're coming from the edges of the map and you can't even block them. I've tried it before where you stand where they're going to spawn, but then they just spawn like one tile further or something. So it doesn't really work like where you can block them like in old games. And I thought this was like a big detriment to the gameplay. Not a huge detriment. It was just annoying because I felt like, it's a strategy game and I want to plan ahead. And I don't want to have to like, play through the mission, be like, oh, the reinforcements spawn here on this like turn, on turn 10 or whatever. So, I got to have units back here for turn 10 to cover my back. So it just felt a little weird because some maps, like I literally had reinforcements like spawn on, like pretty much on top of my units. And then like my unit is like cornered in the edge of the map because all the reinforcements spawned around them, which I thought was a little cheesy. Another thing that annoyed me a little bit about the maps in Engage were some maps had mission objectives that were just straight up lies. Like, when I'm that close to completing an objective, sometimes I'll make a bad play because I know if I complete the objective, I'll win, which, you could say is on my part, but, it's a game that tells me the objective is to do this. So when I do that, I'm not planning for what happens afterwards. If I just do that, I win the mission. But some of them had where it was like, defeat this enemy. Then you defeat the enemy, and then they're like, oh, actually the real objective is this. Which I thought was another thing that was a little unfair, because it was like, how was I supposed to plan for this? Like, why didn't they just make the objective like, kill this guy and this guy, instead of being like, oh, kill this guy, oh, now you gotta kill this guy, Stuff like that was a little annoying on the first playthrough, but it is what it is. I don't think those ones weren't as bad as how much they rely on reinforcements in this game, but it was another downside to the combat in my opinion. That covers most of the stuff I want to talk about in terms of battle, so let's move on to the Somniel. This is the new hub for Fire Emblem Engage. In the hub of Engage, there's stuff like the shops and stuff, so you can buy new weapons, buy new items, and upgrade your weapons. The blacksmith as well is there. There's also a clothing shop if you want to customize your units. I think it only shows how they appear on the Somniel, so like when you're walking around exploring, you can have them wear different outfits if you want. Then there's also activities similar to Fates or Three Houses, such as cooking, which works just like Three Houses, where it'll give stat buffs as well as you can build some support between units. There's fishing, which is just like Three Houses, some extra materials, and it's a fun little minigame. There's training, there's wyvern riding, there's cleaning bond rings. They all give you like small minor effects, but it's mainly they're just like little mini games you can do to mess around with. Then there's also the arena, which is kind of an area you can train your units up at. And then there's the amiibo gazebo. If you have any Fire Emblem amiibos, you can unlock some outfits from the previous games of like, Marth, Byleth, stuff like that. You can also unlock old songs, which is what I was really excited about. You can unlock the original versions of songs that you can assign to your skirmishes. Like if you do any battles to grind or anything like that during your playthrough, you can assign music from the older games. Like if you want to listen to Fodlan Winds from Three Houses, or if you're a fan of the old games, the amiibo gazebo is pretty cool for that. If you have the amiibos, that is. It kind of sucks they're locked behind the amiibos, but I have them because I'm a nerd, and I thought having the music was very cool. Also in the Somniel, there's the pet of Somniel, like the mascot, I guess. We don't know if it's a dog or a cat or whatever, but they call it Somni. I think by default you do get to name it in your game. And you can feed it and pet it as well, and I think that gives you bond fragments, which you can use to upgrade your units. And then aside from that, the last thing is the online trials. So this game has online. It has a PvP mode similar to Fire Emblem Heroes, the mobile game, where basically you build a castle or like a map that you defend and attack from, and then your opponent does as well, and their defense units are AI controlled, but you are attacking like their map, where it merges like your half of the map and their half of the map together, and you can do that. I haven't played around with that too much, so I'm not going to comment on it, but there's also the relay trials, where they give you a fairly hard mission, and basically the way it works is you do 2 turns with your units, then someone will come in, they get to deploy some extra units, and they get to control your units that you were controlling for 2 turns. And basically it goes on like that until you either reach 10 turns and fail, or you just complete the mission. So every 2 turns it passes it off to a new player pretty much. I thought that was a pretty fun way to have a multiplayer mechanic in Fire Emblem. I tried it with my friend early on, and it was pretty funny seeing his units and then my units, and trying to salvage it because we made some mistakes. But that was pretty fun. I like the relay trials. And then there's also Tempest trials, which I think are just very hard missions, kind of meant for the end game, or like after you, like the post game, I guess, once you beat the game. I haven't messed around with those either, so I'm not going to comment on those too much, but I imagine it helps the replayability a bit. So I think that covers most of the Somniel. So overall, I mean, it's a hub. There's nothing like too incredibly fun on it, but it is a nice little like in between the missions. And I did like some of the mechanics, like the cooking and, building supports, obviously. Making that easier is nice, because sometimes I'm not always able to build supports in the battle, so it's nice to be able to do it outside of battle as well. So that was a nice little thing. The hub, overall, it doesn't add too much to the game, but I'm glad it's there. Next up, I just want to talk about the soundtrack real quick. The music in the game was fantastic. I really enjoyed it. The game starts off when you first boot it up with like an anime opening, pretty much. and it's a little cheesy because they, it sounds like an anime opening, like they're singing it, and it's pretty like fast paced and all that. It was a little weird for a Fire Emblem game, but it grew on me even though it is cheesy. But the soundtrack for like battles and gameplay in general, all of it was really, really good. The main theme was good. They had a lot of remixes from the old games, as I said earlier, that were also fantastic. So overall, I really like the soundtrack. My only gripe with it is that in the main story, it did get a little repetitive. I don't know if that's just because I'm a slow player, so I was listening to the same songs for a while. But it felt like, if they threw in like 2 or 3 extra songs in main story missions, just to like, on a couple of the missions where they repeat the same song for battle, it would have been nice just to have like a 1 or 2 more just to spice it up a little bit more. But like I said, that could be on me just taking too long. Basically, the soundtrack was so good, I just want more. So I did really enjoy the music in the game. Now let's talk about the characters in Engage. More from their character, like their actual character side of things and their personality, not the unit gameplay, but the actual characters themselves and supports and that stuff. The characters I used ended up being a lot of the side characters, like the ones who don't show up in the main cutscenes very often, or like they aren't important to the main story overall. So I used a lot of side characters, so that might sway how I feel about characters as a whole, but generally I felt like the characters were written pretty well. There were a lot of child units in this game, which is fine, but like a lot of the supports I felt between 2 child units were a lot of them arguing or whining with each other, which was just annoying in my opinion. But aside from those, like, and not all of them were like that, but just there was a couple that really stuck out to me, and I was like, this is awful to go through. But there are also a lot of really good ones. Characters I really liked were like Louis. He's a knight you meet early on, and he's just, I don't know, he's a very casual guy. He has a lot of funny dialogue, or funny supports and dialogues with other characters, and he was also like my MVP in terms of gameplay, so that just made me like him even more. Then there's also some other characters like Zelkov I really liked. He's an assassin. He seems like a very shady guy, but he actually has a really nice support with another character in the game called Jean, who's a very young child soldier you recruit to your army. And, you think like, oh, this really old assassin guy. Well, he's not really old, but, he's an old assassin guy who's not like a child, like half your army. This is an assassin guy with like the youngest child in your army having a support. You're like, oh god, like I wonder what this is going to be. But no, it's like actually a really heartwarming support, and they have a really nice moment. So that was cool to see. Like some of the supports can be really well thought out and well written.
What'd you think of the party, Rosado?
And a lot of them are long in length, but I want to say maybe like 15% of supports in the game I felt were like either very short or they were not very well written. Like they were just, I don't know, stuff I didn't care about, or they weren't funny, or they weren't, they had no like meaningful purpose to them. But overall, I liked a lot of the supports I got through the game, and I didn't get every support by any means, so maybe there are more bad ones or more good ones, but in general, that's how I felt about the supports. Aside from your main supports, in Engage you also have bonds, which are separate from support conversations, and they're called bond conversations. They're the ones you have with the emblem rings. So as you battle with an emblem ring, you'll increase your bond with them, for that unit specifically that you're battling with it. So every character has bond messages with every emblem. Let's say your main character and Marth have one. They're going to be pretty short. I believe, except for A supports, the C and B are only 1 line from each person. So the main character says 1 line, Marth says 1 line, and then it's over for both C and B. And then A, I think, is 2 lines back and forth. So, it's 1 here, 1 there, 1 here, 1 there. So they're pretty short, but some of them are actually pretty charming. Like one with Zelkov and Edelgard I had. Edelgard is DLC, by the way, but one of the ones I had between those two were Zelkov was like, oh, like war has been draining on me recently, or something like that. And Edelgard's like, oh, the way you just said that right now reminds me of a retainer of my own. Which, if you aren't familiar, that's a callback to Three Houses with Hubert. So I thought that was like a really neat bond conversation, even though it was just 1 line back and forth. But there are a lot of other cool ones that if a character has something in common with the emblem that they're bonding with, sometimes they'll point that out. There's some neat ones, there's some boring ones. But, when it's just 1 conversation back and forth, it's not like it's wasting a lot of time or anything. So even the bad ones, like, I feel like were excusable. And even then, some of them that were kind of bad are still kind of funny in some way. Because sometimes it's just weird hearing characters like Ike be like, oh no, I'm just a huge guy. Like, I don't know, it's just funny seeing like these old Fire Emblem characters interact with characters, and also being voice acted too, some of them for the first time, so that's pretty cool to see. So overall, I like the Bond conversations. They were a nice little touch. Like I said, not all of them were good, but with how little of content they were, some of them were really enjoyable or had nice callbacks to the old games. And last thing I have to mention about the characters, or two last things, are the S supports are in the game for your main character. You can basically, it's not marriage, I guess, but it's called like a pact ring. And basically, it works like an S support, as the previous games do, where you'll get like a special art screen of the character that you give it to, and you also get a paired ending at the end of the game. I will say though, if you want the pact ring, it is locked behind a paralog towards the end of the game. So, one, make sure you get far enough in the game, and also make sure you do, I don't remember the name, but make sure you do a certain paralog to get the pact ring, because if you skip your paralogs, I don't think you get it, and you might miss out on the marriage. I'm not sure. Or the S support, I should say. But yeah, so S supports are in the game. And then aside from that, the endings I mentioned, character endings are back. In this game, other than the person you marry, I believe it is just a character ending per character. I did not get any paired endings in my playthrough, even though multiple characters had A supports with each other, like multiple side characters. So I don't think there are paired endings in this game. I could be wrong, but it seems like all endings are set except for the character you marry, because they get a paired ending with you. So, sorry, I keep on saying marriage, but I don't, it's not confirmed that it's marriage. It's just a pact ring, you know? But either way, you do S support someone, you get a paired ending. All the other endings seem to be set in stone. Quick little side note before we get to the conclusion of the video. I just wanted to mention, in the battles of this game, they changed there's no grid anymore by default, and there's also, when you move your units, you're like moving them in real time instead of like point and clicking where they want to go and then they move. But there are quality of life options you can. Actually, I thought this was really nice. So there's a grid slider. So if you want the grid to be on screen, you can actually slide it to either be like completely visible, half visible, somewhere in between, or have it not visible at all, which I thought was a really neat change. I personally like having at least the grid a little bit visible, just for clarity purpose. And then also, I do prefer the old movement where you point and then click and then they move. It's called like cursor movement, but that is in settings. So I thought that was really nice that they had the option to bring it back to like the older style of games, because personally I do prefer moving characters like that and seeing the grid and stuff. So I thought that was a really nice quality of life change. Here we are, everyone, at the end of the video. So let me wrap everything up in a nice little bow. The story in Engage started off bare bones, and I couldn't really care about the characters because I thought it was goofy looking, like the game as a whole was goofy looking with the new art style. But the more I played, the more I started caring about the characters, and the more I started to feel for the characters. And that changed like my perception of the story like pretty drastically the more I played, because by the end of the game, I said it earlier, I started tearing up towards the end when they started having like some crazy moments at the end. So I definitely did learn to care about the story and the characters. So I think the story just gets better the more you play it, but it does start off as a very basic story. In my opinion, it also had the most fun gameplay in the series, which is, you know, maybe a hot take, but it's my personal opinion. And like the customizability of it, just all the new mechanics they added work so well together, and I really enjoyed the gameplay. Like I said, the biggest gripe for me in the gameplay was how many reinforcements there were. So that is like a drawback, definitely, but it's not, you know, I think the gameplay is still so fun with how customizable it is. And I love talking to my friends about this game because it seems like none of us, you know, gave the same emblem rings to the same characters or even used the same characters. And I thought that's very cool, and that's something I really like about Fire Emblem, is just how different everyone's playthrough can be, even though we're all playing the same game. Overall, as a whole, I would probably give the game, like, objectively, like without my personal opinion on it, probably like an 8 out of 10. But if, you know, with my you know, feelings of the old games and liking the old characters and just being a longtime fan of the series, I'd probably put it at like a 9 out of 10. But, you know, the story does, you know, like I said, it is basic, so that's a big drawback. And also, the combat isn't perfect, like I said, with the reinforcements being a little annoying. And there are other minor things that definitely take from it a little bit, but I would say, like, objectively an 8 out of 10. And if you're a fan of the series, I would say this is like a must-have. It's pretty, like, if you love the old games, just seeing the characters again and seeing all the neat little references, even if you're not a fan of the more modern games, I think you'll enjoy it. If unless you just really can't stand the new ones for some reason whatsoever. But I think it is really cool just for any longtime fans to see the old characters in a new game, and the game still is very fun. If you're a new fan or you haven't even played a Fire Emblem, I would still recommend checking it out if anything in this video seemed interesting, or if I won you over with my I don't know, my review. But if anything seemed interesting, I would recommend picking it up. You don't need to get all the references to enjoy the game. If you think this game looks very fun, or you like strategy games in general, I think this is fairly easy to pick up compared to some other strategy games, especially with, I said, the difficulty seems a little lower in this game. But yeah, I would recommend it if this seemed interesting to you. But if you looked at this and you thought this was not interesting at all, then, obviously this should probably be a skip for you. And one more thing before the very end is I did get to play DLC Wave 1 and Wave 2. I think Wave 1 was available day 1, and then Wave 2 just came out literally the day I think I beat the game. So I got the characters and then did, I unlocked them by doing their missions, and then I played the final mission. So I didn't get to experience Wave 2 characters too much, but their maps were good. It was fun unlocking them, because it's extra maps, and then you get the emblem rings for the DLC that's out right now is Tiki, Soren, Hector, and Camilla. And then there you get the 3 houses with Edelgard, Claude, and Dimitri all in one. And so far, I would say the DLC, I would recommend it already. It's $30, and they announced that there's going to be another wave with, I believe, Crom and Robin, and then Veronica from Heroes. And then they're also going to have a story DLC at the very end that is going to be like a side story, or it might be tied into the main story somewhere. But yeah, so I would definitely recommend it already if you're a fan. If you know the old characters, I think it's a must-have, because it's just cool seeing, like I said earlier, it's just cool seeing the old characters in a new game and having their abilities. So if you're a fan of the series, I would definitely recommend the DLC. But yeah, I did get to play around with a little bit of the DLC in my playthrough. I know I said the last thing was the last thing, but this is the last thing. So my playthrough took me about 90 hours, which I think is overestimate, probably because I was either AFK or I just took really long on missions sometimes, or I'm doing a mission on a Discord call, so my turns are taking even longer than they normally do. So I would say that's probably over the standard. I would say probably expect a 60 to 70 hour playthrough, but if you're a slow player, or maybe if you're a fast player, adjust it accordingly. But the game does have a lot of content, and that was just one playthrough all the way through with Wave 1 and Wave 2 DLC to do as well. So expect around that much hours of gameplay. And then if you're interested in going to a second playthrough, because there's a lot of units I didn't get to use, so I'm thinking of doing a second playthrough, possibly on maddening difficulty, to see how hard it gets. But yeah, I wanna go back in and see the characters that I didn't give the limelight on in my first playthrough. So I think there is replayability, but it's not like you're going to have a different route like you did in 3 Houses or some of the other games. So, good amount of playtime, replayability depending on how dedicated of a fan you are, I guess. So that's everything, guys. This is the end of the video. Thank you all for watching. If you have any comments about, how I could do this video better, maybe it should be longer, should it be shorter, did I miss something? Let me know down in the comments below. I do greatly appreciate it, and this is only my second review on YouTube, so I would appreciate any comments on that. But here we are at the end, so you know what the deal is. I'm Shorleapums, and I love Fire Emblem Engage. Aww.